Okay, I think we're live. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for MediaNama's session on detecting Pegasus in India. Normally, we would do this as a members-only call, but given the public interest involved here, we thought it's important to live stream this and make it publicly available. Anand Venkatanarayanan is joining us today for this session. Anand is a cybersecurity and privacy researcher. He's a technical advisor with DeepStrat and has 2 decades of experience in the corporate sector at AT&T, Intel, and NetApp across multiple domains such as telecom protocols, network engineering, device drivers for graphics chips, Linux device drivers for file systems, and storage management products. He was recently called as an expert witness before the Committee on Pegasus appointed by the Supreme Court of India. And so today he's going to demonstrate for us how he detected Pegasus on the smartphones of 2 eminent Indian journalists, Siddharth Varadarajan, founding editor of The Wire, and Sushant Singh, former Indian Express journalist. Anand will answer key questions such as what was found on these infected devices? How do we determine that it's Pegasus and not some other malware? And finally, what are the indicators that point towards the involvement of the Indian government? So Anand, I will let Anand take over now. Anand, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming and listening to the talk. This is pretty much a variation of the presentation that I gave to the Supreme Court appointed Justice Ravindran Committee, except that I've stripped down some details, which is probably a bit too much to digest for a non-technical audience. I've not skimmed the interesting parts, but deep dives into certain areas have been cut short because of the time consideration and appealing for a broad audience. So most of it is pretty similar, but some of it has changed compared to what you had seen on the deposition. The deposition is probably about 400 pages long. So obviously, I'm not going to be able to do all that, right? So let us start. Anyway, Nishant gave a very short intro about me. Of late, I've been more interested, to be honest, on the cognitive aspect of cyber, particularly in information warfare, influence operations, and less on cyber, but Linux malware still I keep dabbling around with it for now. So this particular engagement on Pegasus was done because one of the petitioners in the Supreme Court, Professor Jagdeep Chokar, asked me to help him to figure out what is happening on his phone because his name came in. So most of the work happened after the public report came. So it was probably conducted from August to December. That is how the work was. So let's go forward. So just to give a topic map, what are we going to cover? This is the broad topic map. I will just show what is found on the phones of the journalists, Siddharth Varadarajan and Sushant Singh. This should take about 10 minutes. And then why do we think it is Pegasus and why it is not some other malware? That will take about 20 odd minutes. And then we go to the other part, saying that why it is most likely the government of India and not someone else. That would take another 10 minutes. So this is basically the general topic map. I will pause in between a section. If there are any questions, I will answer that before moving to the next section. But if you want to put all the questions towards the very end, that is fine as well. Okay. So let us go back on the first part, right? So here is the interesting part in order to give a description of what this thing is about. So this particular episode exercise was only conducted on the iPhones of Siddharth Varadarajan and Sushant Singh. And iPhones have a very interesting property. And the most interesting property of an iPhone is that it keeps a immutable long-term log of every single app that you had ever opened and ran from the time in which you bought and activated the iPhone. This is a pretty unique feature of the iPhone, which you would not find it in Android. And what it really means is that imagine that you have an iPhone which is like 6 years old. The log that I get inside that, which is there are typically 2 files. One is called data usage and then .SQLite and net usage.SQLite. Both these files exist in the iPhone from the time in which you activate it to the time in which you trash it. I mean, and it is immutable to a large extent. I mean, there are exceptions to that, but it is mostly the case. It is immutable in the sense that you can only add to it, you can't delete it. I mean, so that is basically the structure of this log. Now, the log that you're seeing on the screen is an example of what that iPhone log is about. So you can open it on your phone, and if you use the iTunes backup, you will actually see this file also, I mean, as part of that. So what you see here is, look at this thing called bundle ID. This basically tells you that there is an app called com.apple.stocks, which I had opened. I mean, this log came from my own iPhone. And then it shares that what is the date in which it is launched, which is first ISO date. And what is the last date it was run? This is a live ISO date. This is like literally like a timestamp. And the most interesting part about this is the process name called proc_name. You can just see what this means. What it really means is that when the application runs, you will see a trace in this particular location in the file system. So generally, this is, imagine how it will going to look. I will just show you how it's going to look. Just a minute. Okay. So this is the file. I mean, so you can just see it goes from this is Sushant, it goes from 6/9/2020. It just keeps going, and you can just see how many files it has. You're probably looking at 15,000 entries. So if you see any other file, any other person's log that is there in their phone, it could be probably 500 KB, 200 MB, whatever. And it just registers everything. So iPhone, in a way, when they come and tell you that iPhone is a very interesting application or a phone, there is a lot of historical reason why it is why we are seeing what we are seeing about the iPhone. So I'll just go back to resume share. Stop it. Go back to the slides. Okay. All right, back to where we started. So how do we know that this particular application com.apple.stocks is really a normal application or it is a malware? You can actually search for this name called com.apple.stocks in the Android Play Store, sorry, iPhone Play Store, and you would probably hit something like this. So what it really means, what it really tells you is that it is possible to establish forensically which are all the applications that ran on your phone, which are what is the process name under which it ran, and where was it actually found. And if you look at it, if you click on that, you will know this is given by Apple and what was the version number and so on and so on. So this is what we call as process metadata. It really doesn't matter to us when we actually look at your phone what a particular application is. In order to determine whether it is malware or not, the first set of operations that you have to perform really is, what is this application? What is the purpose? Who's the vendor? And could we find it in Play Store? Or did you install it directly from the iOS store? Or you just basically did a side load? I mean, if you're into Android development or Play Store iOS development, you can load it directly from your computer. So, I mean, a whole bunch of things is actually possible. But just looking at this one single file, it turns out that all it really requires in order to determine whether a particular phone is malware infected or not, one very good way is to look at this file. Nothing more is really required. I mean, that is the beauty of the iPhone. Notice that you would not find anything like this in the Android, which makes forensic determination very difficult, because the normal way to catch a malware would be to do a live analysis. You basically get the person's phone, and then you have to do a live analysis. But the iPhone allows you to do forensics in the sense that I can get the phone, I can just take this particular log file, and then offline I can conduct an analysis to figure out what is going on. And if you notice Pegasus infections, most of the infections were actually detected and found on the iPhone only because of this immutable database. There is really no other reason why we could find it, because if Android had it, which people called as inspectability, we could have found it in Android also to a large extent, but it is not. So there are other methods. But this is like a foolproof forensic method of finding it. Okay. So now let's go back to look at what that means. So if I basically run this miniature script, what it basically tells you is a normal phone. This is a bundle IDs. This just tells about all the applications that I'm running on the phone. So this is an example of, I mean, forget this JQ and all it basically does is in a JSON file, you just extracted bundle ID and then sorted and unique them. And you can just see all the files, all the applications that I install on my phone, like FaceTime, Find My, Game Center, News, Podcast, Stocks, of the Google Maps, and so on and so on. So every one of these files, except this null thing, is basically a traceable application that you can find on the iOS store. The null is basically a cumulative usage tracker. It is basically an operating system application that runs for usage. So except that part, everything else is very clear that this is basically how a normal phone would look like. Now let's go back further. So remember, there were two parts of every application. One is the name of the application that you downloaded from the iOS store, and this is the name of the process. So if you understand typically how computers work, every application that runs on a phone needs to have a process name. This is an example of a process name. This is something that people usually do it on Linux by doing ps-aef, or if you go to Windows and say process manager, look, what is the name of the application? iOS has a similar kind of a model, and this is basically the process name. So again, you can see all this very clearly that there is a one-to-one correspondence between what is the name of the app that you installed and what is the name of the process name, what is the process name under which it runs. So this is typically how it works. And this is where it gets very interesting. This is again my phone. So what is very interesting about the iPhone is that there is also this idea about background processes. Some of you would have noticed when you operate your iPhone to look at it and say, shut down the background process. It is one small icon that comes on your iPhone. What that means is that it is basically a feature given by Apple for operating system devised for application developers, that there are some tasks that you have to do it on the background, and that need not have the app running in the front. So this is basically a background worker kind of a process name. And this is an example of SMB client. SMB client is Samba client. So what I use in my iPhone is I have a bunch of Windows shares, which I access from my iPhone. There is no app that actually allows me to access the Windows shares. But it is basically a background process called Samba, SMB client D. So you can see a very interesting part here. When I basically look at the process name and ask what is the background process, there is only one here in my application in my phone called SMB client D, which is what I use for accessing Windows share. And so this also gets registered. So the interesting bit about data usage.json or the data usage SQLite file is that it registers everything that happens on your phone, right down to which process got executed, what is the background process name, what is the app that you install, whether it is an operating system app, and so on and so on. So this is like a clean forensic record that is run on the operating system level across every single person. So this is how it works. Now let's go back and look at one of the phones, which is Siddharth's phone. This is what I found. So this is basically me figuring out the last line is all that is really required for you to find out whether he is having a virus. So if you look at what is the background process that is not attached to any application is running, this is the list that you get, right? And Siddharth has been using this phone from 2012. So you would see a whole bunch of background processes. So what has actually happened is we went and verified which one of these background processes has a known application. Almost everything checked out, except these three interesting applications, PCS D, role account D, staging D. You would not find anywhere in the world any application that uses these process names that gets launched across these process names. So this is basically what is referred as an anomaly. And this anomaly says that something is not right about his phone, okay? When we say something is not right about a phone, it is usually a malware, because why else would you have an application that is not found on Play Store, that is not viewable anywhere, doing something like this, okay? Now, this is another example of Sushant's phone. It is the same thing that ran. So again, Sushant is a much recently bought iPhone. So if you look at the background processes that were running on his phone, just like mine, there was only one legit app called Exchange Sync D. It is kind of obvious what it is trying to do. It is basically, he has an Outlook account, Outlook.com account, and he has an Exchange account as part of his work. So both of them uses it for background synchronization. And of course, there's a very suspicious process name here called BFRGBD. So this is another example of anomaly. So this two anomaly is basically look at it and say, well, this looks like this is a malware, right? I mean, what is it doing? Why is it doing? Again, remember, this is not a live analysis. This is just extracting the background log file from his phone and looking at it and wondering what exactly is going on here. Let's move further. So far what we have done in this process is just merely look at very two interesting names. Now, how does it mean that, what is the evidence that we come back and say it is actually Pegasus? So this is a bit involved. So please pay a bit more attention. So in order to understand why someone can conclude that this is actually a Pegasus process, it is important to notice something very interesting. Malwares in general have a big ontology. When I say ontology, you can think of the COVID ontology. So people draw this sequence diagrams by saying that I found the first virus in China, then there was a next variation, then there was a next variation, and then you draw all those nice looking parent, children, tertiary, B1 or B delta, gamma, beta. I mean, it is basically like a lineage, parental lineage kind of a approach. Now, that is the same kind of model that we use even when we track viruses and malware and across every operating system wise. So this is called as an infection ontology for a lack of a better name. So if you look back and say that Pegasus is one of those very interesting malware which has been around from 2012 onwards. And 2016 onwards, there has been exceptional amount of open source research that was conducted on Pegasus completely before the current controversies came in. So it may actually be quite surprising to a lot of people that from 2016 onwards, it was extensively analyzed and reported. So if you go back and look at what happened, there were quite a few incidents that happened, which allows us to conclude that the BFR BGD process names that you see on these guys' phone is basically Pegasus. I will just tell what this is and I'll explain that later. So this is basically an ontology. There was a first incident report on 2016. It was a first unmasked. Quite a lot of data came out during that time. Then variant number 2 of the same Pegasus was detected on 2018. Then variant number 3 was detected on 2019. Variant number 4 was detected on 2020. A similar variant was detected on 2018-21, and then another one on 2018-21. And then if you actually trace back, this is how the variant looks like. So if you look back what has happened, what we found on Siddharth's phone is essentially the same variant that was found on 2019 in a person called Monty Mujib's phone. And what was found on Sushant Singh's phone is the same variant that was found on SAR Gilani's phone and Khatija, who was an Azerbaijani or Ukrainian person's phone in 2018. So if you draw a map, this is basically how an infection ontology looks like, and that is one of the reasons why we concluded that the malware that was found on these two people's phone is actually the same Pegasus malware that has been researched from 2016. Just go a bit deeper into this. Okay, so what was the first unmasking? So in case some of you understand the terminology, here I have no choice than to explain the terminology. Just like how you buy guns and bullets in the dark market, I mean in UP you call them as katta gun or whatever. Exploits and malware, exploits are also like guns and bullets in the sense that a malware is basically developed in the same process in which you write software. You have dependencies, you have third-party dependencies, and you buy them, you acquire them. Here, what they do in the malware development is they acquire vulnerabilities. And the way in which vulnerability process works is that you as a security researcher report it to the vendor, but most of the times vendor don't pay you any money. And hence what has happened is because vendors don't pay you any money or they threaten you and all, most of the vulnerability researchers do sell their vulnerabilities to a dark market vendor. And this is a pretty interesting area which I will not go into, but it is pretty similar to how weapons development works. Just like you have weapon manufacturers, weapon brokers, and you will have dark market developers, munition traders, and so on and so on. And so there were a very interesting development that happened in 2015, where 3 different vulnerabilities, all that allowed a remote exploit on an iOS phone, was sold on a zero-day market in 2015. You cannot just buy one of these and develop a malware. You have to buy all the 3 together and then chain them together in order to make it work. And this was the first time Pegasus was actually detected in the wild when people said, what is going on my phone? Because the phone was running pretty hot.
Anand, could you explain what a zero-day market is again?
Okay. A zero-day market is, so the way in which it works is that every software has vulnerabilities which can be exploited. And what you typically do is that you report the vulnerabilities to the vendor. Now, let us say I found something in WordPress. I go to WordPress developers and say, this is a vulnerability, go fix it. A similar thing happens with Google, Android, iOS. Every software in the market basically has a vulnerability. I mean, it is a fact of life. But the vendors don't pay you money. They will pay you $100. I mean, and sometimes they threaten you to put you in jail and they don't reply and all. So what you do is you go to an exploit broker and you say, look, I have this wonderful vulnerability, which basically allows me to pawn this product. And the guy looks at you and say, well, what's your price? And then he then goes back and you usually get about 10x more money selling your vulnerability to the exploit broker compared to the actual vendor whose product you found the vulnerability for. And this is the supply. On the demand side, he basically sells these vulnerabilities to nation-state agencies. The NSA was almost all nation-state agencies, the Western intelligence agencies, have a huge pile of these vulnerabilities, and they go and procure them to develop their own spyware. And so what the vendor does, so what the exploit broker does is that he buys it from you in one end and he gives it to the other end, and he takes about 30 to 35% cut on the price. So this entire supply and demand of vulnerabilities is called as a zero-day market. Zero-day means the vendor doesn't know about it, but everyone else apart from the vendor knows about it.
So this if I may just recap, Anand, let me just start on just recapping for those who joined late. What you're saying is that when so there is a mechanism for analyzing phones, especially iPhones, because iPhones keep a log of every single app or every single service that you have access, that you, if you're an iPhone user, have accessed. And most of the processes that are listed there can be linked to a particular app on the Apple App Store. But in case of both Sushant Singh as well as Siddharth Varadarajan, there were certain processes that were shown that do not conform to any particular publicly used app as such. So that indicates to us that there was software running which is basically potentially malware. Correct?
Correct.
And then you demonstrated the code or that indicated that these are the particular processes that were running. And this is not possible with Android because Android doesn't keep that log.
Correct.
And now what you're doing is you're indicating what has happened in terms of detecting Pegasus as a part of demonstrating to us how it's likely that what these 2 phones were infected with was Pegasus, or what these 2 phones were impacted by was Pegasus. Correct?
That is correct.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anand. Sorry, I just want to recap because there are a few people who joined late.
Okay. So this is the structure of a zero-day market. So in this particular case, zero-day market is not like a dark market. I mean, everyone knows who's buying and who's selling. In this case, these 3 vulnerabilities was bought by the NSO group. I mean, there are receipts for it. And the initial malware was actually was actually resident in the sense that it wouldn't vanish when the phone is rebooted. So it was captured. And just like how we do malware analysis is via what is called as reverse engineering. I mean, there is a very costly product on the market called IDA Pro. You take a binary application and you put it, it will just reverse engineer and you can see C code or C++ code or Java code, whatever. And then you go back and look at the malware sample. I mean, the source is available for anyone who's interested on GitHub repositories. So this is basically 2016. So everything about Pegasus was actually known on 2016, much before any of these controversies came into picture. Okay. So what was actually found on 2016 is that we found that when Pegasus launches, it uses these weird process names called workerd, systemd, watchdogd. None of this was actually traceable to any internal services that Apple has it or any of the third-party services. We even have the C code foil for it. I mean, which is what is called the bridgehead, which is the first time it enters the phone, and then the way in which it does is it will not. The bridgehead service is not a full malware. It just enters, and then it downloads more other stages. It's a staged malware. We also knew by reverse compiling the code that it had full read-write access to device. I mean, both the Android and iOS is fully analyzed. And the interesting part about the malware is that every malware needs to have a command and control server because it is an instrument of exfiltration. It just takes data out from the phone. It has to store it somewhere else. So it usually talks back to the command and control server. So this is again a very standard malware terminology, just like how every intelligence agent has a handler, every malware actually has a handler, and this is a command and control server. Now, the interesting bit about that is because it is actually caught live, people knew what the command and control servers were, and they were able to fingerprint them. Fingerprinting a command and control server is by saying that, is this the command and is this server has a very unique signature, and what is that signature? So that part was also done on 2016. And the most interesting thing about Pegasus is that its user manual was leaked by a competitor. It's a called Hacking Team. And so we have the complete user manual as well. And almost all of this was reconfirmed by Apple. And they basically did a lot of analysis and says everything what is correct is right. They went and changed a whole bunch of stuff in the iOS in order to fix these issues. So this was on 2016. Okay. Now, what has happened on 2018 was, once you detected this is the command and control server and this is the fingerprint, Citizen Labs, I think during the time, basically wrote a scanning tool to sweep the entire internet to see which of those servers in the internet are actually Pegasus command and control servers. So people may come back and say, but how the hell do you sweep the internet? I mean, is it not hard? I mean, nowadays we don't think too much about it, but it was probably a very important question in 2016. Nowadays, you have this internet sweeps services called Shodan and all kind of stuff. So they can sweep the entire internet in about 45 minutes to 1.5 hours. So it may probably take a lot of bandwidth, but if you have that amount of bandwidth, it's 45 minutes. If you have less amount of bandwidth, it's probably about 2 days. So this is typically done via a whole bunch of open source tools, and one of that is given to you by the ZMap project. So what the sweep actually found was that there was about 1,091 IP addresses, which are mapped to 1,014 domain names, and the time is August 2016 to 2018. And we found there were quite a bit of Indian domains found they were found communicating from these ASNs. I'll come back to that later. So this is 2018. So just to recap what we have, we basically had a whole bunch of domains. We knew which of these domains to which Pegasus is communicating, and we knew what were the process names that were being used and the malware source code, etc., etc. So this was in 2018. Let's go back on 2019. What happened? Because it was the domain names were all fingerprinted. When Moti Mojib's phone was analyzed on 2019, it was found that in his phone there were similar processes, and one was this weird process name called roll about the PCST FMLD, the same thing that we found on Siddharth's phone. This was actually talking back to a server, which CNC servers on these names like stopsms.biz, infospress, revolutionnews.co, and 324sounddownloads.com. So it was kind of very obvious that, okay, this was the domains that NSO was using for controlling the Pegasus infections. So with Monty Majid's case, what has happened again is that we knew 2016 was NSO was the buyer. All the servers that they were using were fingerprinted from 2016 to 2018. And this is the same. And in 2019, an infection was found, which was using process names like rollabout D and FMLD, PCSD, but which were communicating to the earlier fingerprinted 2016-18 CNC servers. So now we know that really 2019 was NSO, and these were the extra signatures, rollabout D and PCSD. This is exactly the same thing that was found on Siddharth's phone. So this part is basically frozen up. Now let's move further. So now the other interesting thing that happened on 2020, there was one more case by Omar Radi. I think he's some Saudi journalist, or I forgot really what it is, or Azerbaijani. Okay. So again, in his phone also, this is again a version 3. So it had some parts of version 2 and some parts of the next version. Same process names were found, rollabout D, PCSD, FMLD was found. And 2 more names but it had again a correlation with previously used CNC servers. But 2020 was interesting because this is the first time something pretty interesting has happened on Pegasus. It started planting files on the phone. And this is primarily because, so if you look at what Apple does, you have this auto update service. That service can be suppressed if you plant files with a particular structure and character on a location in a file system. That is usually not allowed by any app. So Pegasus started planting files on the file system in order to suppress the software update. Then when there is remember, malware and exploits are not like 100% robust, so they crash often. And every time a process crashes, Apple gets a report. So before they start exploiting, they basically put these files to suppress the crash reporting. So these were the 2 files that were getting planted on the file system. I will later show that how to detect that these files were planted versus what is the actual file. But it is very easy to figure out which are the planted files on your phone because they have a very unique signature. So what happened again in 2020, Umar Adi's case is we knew that this is like next version of Pegasus and it has matchings with the previous version of the malware. So we have this conclusion kind of a thing which says that even 2020 was Umar Adi. Now going further, why I'm saying this. Again, Khadija Ismailia's case is very interesting because whoever was trying to trap her was pretty desperate. Her phone had 3 different versions of Pegasus. Usually you don't find this. This is like finding Delta, Omicron, and the first version of COVID all on one patient's body. And then you figure out, oh my God, this is fantastic, right? So her phone also had 3 different versions of Pegasus. And the most likely hypothesis is that maybe it were 3 different intelligence agencies all given the task to figure out what she was doing. And then everyone used their own version of Pegasus on her. And then again, you will see the same thing on her. You saw this role account D, staging D, process names, which was similar to Monty Majid and Amar Radi. And this is version 4. So it was even better than the previous versions. So this is the first time it started doing what is called a self-erase. So typically what happens in most of the malware is that the malware has to save itself. It needs state. So you would find the malware app, the .exe file or whatever you guys call it in other thing. You will find the actual malware resident on the physical hard disk. And what it normally does is it just goes and modifies the operating system entries in such a way that the first process that starts after an operating system boot is the malware. But that is how usually researchers analyze the malware and do reverse engineering and so on and so on. Version 4 of the malware was very interesting because it never left any traces on the file system except those planted files. It would run as long as the phone runs. It will keep everything in memory, and the phone reboots. It will just die, right? You can't actually analyze it on a persistent basis. And then what will happen is when you reboot the phone, the backend, the command and control server will detect that, oh, this particular phone has not been communicating with me for about a day, and it tries to reinfect it. So this is the first time. This is the most advanced version of Pegasus, which got everyone very interesting because no one has ever seen this kind of stuff before. And the other interesting thing that happened on this version 4 is that this is the first time it was using iMessage. Until then, how the first stage of malware enters your phone is via SMS. So what happens is they will send you an SMS, you have to do a click on it, or sometimes they will do what is called as network injection by saying that, like if you type yahoo.com, it will not go to yahoo.com, it will go to the malware server, but only if you use HTTP, not HTTPS. I mean, there are other techniques that were not very robust, but this was one robust technique they figured out, as this is the reason why it was now called zero click, in the sense that most of the Apple users had enabled iMessage. And so if you send an iMessage to the particular phone user, it will automatically install Pegasus without any human intervention. So this is basically a version 4 of Pegasus, which was found in Khatija. The fact that her phone had V2, V3, V4 allowed everyone to go back and do a lot of data around how it works, what it works, etc., etc. And it was also lively detected. So this was reconfirmed by Trend Macro, again reconfirmed by Apple, and further confirmed by Apple lawsuit on NSO. And then Google again went and wrote a wonderful blog article about how the zero-click vector works, and so on and so on. So this is Khatija. And then this is the most interesting name, in case you recognize. He's the guy who was involved in the parliament attack thing, and he was always an interest to our local intelligence agencies. He was acquitted, but they also kept him. And his phone also had 3 different versions of Pegasus. Again, in his phone is the first time you find this weird process name called BFRGBD. This ComNetD is an older version of Pegasus, F7D is an older version of Pegasus. So there's again 3 different versions of Pegasus, which were very similar to what you found on Khatija Ismailia's phone. So this is like a overall sequence of how the entire forensics work. So with this, what you found, based on a simple log file of 500 KB, you can see this ontology again. This is first unmasking, internet sweep. You found role account D, a weird process name, on this first 2 instances, and on Monty Majid's name, which is exactly what we found in Siddharth's phone. And then there was V4 of Pegasus, which was found in Umar Radi's and Khatija's phone, which was also found on Sar Gilani's phone, which was exactly the same malware that they had used on Sushant Singh's phone. So these are, Sushant Singh's is a very great example of a very clean phone, in the sense that it's a pretty new phone. And so if you go back and look at what I showed you, hang on a minute. These are the only 2 background processes that Sushant's phone ever had. The BFRGBD is the Pegasus malware, and X2 But on the contrary, if you go to Siddharth's phone, because it was like a very old phone and has been on operation for 60 years on, you could see, I mean, a lot of forensic investigation was required. It is still not possible to ascertain how it got in, because that part is unclear, but it was very clear that it was actually the phone that ran on his phone. Okay, so this is where we are now, right? Just check the time. I'm doing good. Okay, right. So just to roll back on what happened, when I actually got access to this phone. So here is a problem with the forensic research on iPhone. When you actually take an iPhone backup, it gives you everything about your life. Your iTunes backup has your call data records, your SMS records, whom you met, who was the same person who you were sharing your room with within 5 meters radius, your Bluetooth data. So the sheer amount of data that you actually have on your iPhone is actually mind-boggling. And a person like me who basically looks at it doesn't want that kind of data on me. So, I mean, so when you basically go and tell them that please give your phone for analysis, that results in lots of who the hell are you types, right? So we have to basically do some shortcuts, and I'll explain why the shortcuts were interesting. The way in which forensics works typically in any court is that the device is taken and the full image of the device is taken, and they'll give you a hash value. They typically don't like to delete stuff from the device. But in this particular case, if I had followed the same approach, I wouldn't have gotten even the base minimum data that these guys were. So I basically took the forensic backup, deleted everything except those 3 or 4 log files, which I was very interested in, which are mostly metadata. And then I gave it back. And so the analysis is actually pretty simple. Like I told you, it is an SQLite file. You can run this yourself by running a simple SQL query. I will just show a minute. Hang on a minute. So it's not hard at all. So if you look back, so this is basically a decrypted kind of a thing. That's it. So all you really need to do, Pegasus, is basically get this SQLite file and run this one command, and then look at whether it is BFR GBD. That is it. That is all that is really required for you to prove that someone's phone is basically Pegasus infected. It's actually pretty simple once you get the hang of it. But in order to find out what is the name that you have to look for, that is like 6-7 years of work. And so that is basically the hard problem in this domain, in the sense that you really have to go back and dig data around in order to figure this out. Okay. So again, coming back to Siddharth. So again, in Siddharth's phone, we found that these two files were planted, which is Crash Reporter and one more file. But no one knows what the delivery mechanism is. The next thing is Sushant's. Sushant's phone is, again, he only gave me the backup on December 2021. Again, I had to follow the same process of removing all PII data. But Sushant's phone is interesting because the delivery mechanism was the zero-click vector of iPhone.
Anand, I think you'll have to explain what PII data is.
Okay. All right. PII is personally identifiable data. I will go back and show you what PII is, not on someone else, but on my own phone. Okay. All right. So if you look at the PII data, this is basically the kind of data that you get. Just look at calls.json, contacts. So if you go back and look at calls.json, surprise, surprise, surprise. Every single call that I ever made is actually there, sitting there. To which person, what location, what is the start time, what is the end time, whether I used Signal, telephone, Facebook, whatever, right? And even if you go back and say clear, that will not go away. So surprise, that is how Apple works, right? Same thing with your Safari history. So if you go back and look at my Safari history, it has everything. What is this borrowing? What am I supposed to do? What I was doing? Every single link. What is the redirect source? And then the locations have been on iPhone. And what are my contacts? Then there is a whole bunch of stuff about my configuration profiles. Then TCC is an example of what are all the permissions I gave for various apps during what time and what kind of consent, and then the Safari browser state. I mean, I don't use WhatsApp. I don't have any other interesting applications on the phone except Signal. And that is completely wiped out. But if you have WhatsApp and if you have other applications, all the data is also available as part of this process. So even your file system data, your photos, everything that you think you have on your phone, it has much more, including your health data. So this is what we call as personally identifiable information.
So Anand, you were saying that you removed all the personally identifiable information from the image that you took from their phones.
Correct.
Correct. And then you ran.
Correct. Right, because the only thing that I really require to confirm Pegasus is this single file called data_usage.json. I don't need any other file. Yeah, is this part clear?
Yeah, we'll get to questions later on.
Yeah, fair enough. So I mean, this is just to demonstrate about what is what. I'll go back. And I mean, people, of course, had questions saying, why did you do it? I mean, the answer is that I'm an uncleared third party. If I had not agreed to do it, I wouldn't have been able to do anything. And anyway, it was not really required for me to confirm Pegasus. Okay, so the other interesting thing was the iPhone attachments. The iMessage attachments are known. So for instance, hang on a minute. I'm sorry, I keep switching. if you go back and look at the iMessages for Sushant, this is what's called as ID status cache.json. So an example is, let us say he wants to find some person. So this is basically nearby. This is one of the most sensitive parts. I have no choice than to do this. So this basically tells which all the phones are near him. I mean, and so on and so on. But here, if you look at
like, but Anand, I don't think we need to go through this. Right? This is not very
No, this is the last part that is required. This is basically the iPhone. This is basically a signature of the person who sent him the malware, gmail.com. This is basically the address used by the malware writer. Okay. So this is basically a confirmation that was actually the iMessage part. That is how the malware got into the phone. That is the only reason why I had to get this from his phone. Otherwise, I don't even needed this. Okay. So let us going back. What is the last part of it? Doing well on time. Yeah. What is the last part of it, and why is this most likely the government of India? So I'll come back to that. So let's look at the key facts again. Pegasus was only sold to national governments and law enforcement agencies according to their own version. This is usually export controlled by the Israeli DECA. DECA is Defense Export Control Agency. And here is the interesting question. Did the government of India buy it? The answer is yes. How do we know about it? It turned out that we knew about the fact that the government of India did buy it on 2019 itself, when there were a lot of Pegasus infections reported on the WhatsApp case. So this particular report was written by me and Cybersecurity Datta, who was then a journalist in Asia Times. And when we actually made the inquiry on 2019, the IB did confirm to us that they did buy Pegasus. They were one of the license holders of Pegasus. Okay, so this was way back in 2019, much before any of NYT and everyone basically confirmed it. This is as good as source-based confirmation that you got, right? Not documents, but a person who actually operates it told us about it, right? So then, of course, you have the Nyk report, which came in on January 2020, which fundamentally confirmed everything what we had known about Pegasus, right? Saying that this was bought in 2017, 2018. And if you look at the logs, I will not go into description about what was the logs that Forbidden Stories had. It was very clear that India only had the capability for 100 Pegasus infections at a particular time. So what they actually bought was most likely IB and RAW had two different systems. Each system was configured for 50 infections, and everyone basically. So if you want to go and hit the next target, you have to remove the previous target. So every target basically had a from date and a to date. So you would know precisely which target was inserted into Pegasus and which at what point of time the target was exited out of Pegasus. And both Siddharth's and Sushant's logs actually match the insertion dates. And so is the case of every confirmed target, but I didn't do it. But in this particular case, it is kind of obvious that these are the two people who are interested in it. Okay. And what are the next set of facts? Go look at target selection. Which other government would be interested in this precise set of targets? Of course, here we are going into the part of inference because it is forensics. Forensics can tell you only the murder has happened, who's basically the particular person who did it and ordered it. I mean, that part is inference based on the target selections. So which the particular target selection that we have, it is kind of obvious no one else would be interested but government India. We know for a fact that at least 2 licenses were existed at least, and some part of it were also shipped to some state headquarters. And then the hardware purchase and installation details were also known. And so this is one of the reasons why I told that the way in which this hardware works is that it is not an app that you can just put and install in Play Store. It requires a very big infrastructure. So the infrastructure is known. You need about 100 square feet rooms with multiple ISP connectivities, the SMS connectivities, and network injection capabilities, and so on and so on. So this is not an equipment you can just go randomly put in some weird data center. The best place you have to put this is a telco data center, and data center that is operated by the telcos. There is really no other way to actually go and put this equipment as. Okay, and the way in which this equipment again works is that that part is also pretty much known. It cannot be a public facing thing, but it needs to have a public internet access in order to do injections. And so it is physical hardware sitting in at least 2 or 3 big data centers of telcos in order for it to work. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. Okay. And hence, when you actually look at the 2017 report, which Citizen Labs put on the internet scan, these are the two interesting things I found over the ASINs. Look at an ASIN is an autonomous system number, which is given to every telco, and every ASIN has a bunch of IPs associated with it. So when I looked at it, one thing that kind of jumped out to me when I looked at the ASINs is that this 9498 and 24560 are pretty interesting, because if I were to actually connect Pegasus hardware installation in a network, I would, if I were the advisor to the intelligence folks, I would ask them to do it on 9498 and 24560. Not because if you look at the BGP info, the routing info, this two ASINs had the maximum connectivity across all around the world. So if you're RNAW and you want to infect targets all around the world, you would want to put your stuff on 9498 or on 24560, but not on something between, because every other ASN has less bandwidth and less global connectivity. So this is one of the reasons why I strongly believe that if you go around and ask the telcos and say, who are your clients, and was hardware developed or deployed in your data centers during this time, you would have a pretty good chance of figuring out where was it installed. So that is one of the reasons why these ASINs are interesting to me. Okay, yeah, I think I am done.
So Anand, before we get to questions, I mean, I have a few questions first. So you can't conclusively say that this is the Indian government, right? There is no data trail specifically pointing towards an agency or a government from a technical perspective. No,
you can't do it from a technical point of view, because all you ended up doing was forensics, and forensics tells you what the dead body is. I mean, it is, then you basically do inference based on available facts to come back and say there are only two hypotheses. Hypothesis number one is Indian government. Hypothesis number two is some other foreign government. You do preponderance of probabilities and say the probability that the hypothesis one is true is much higher than the probability that hypothesis two is true.
My second question is, in terms of these agencies that you said may have deployed this particular malware, do we have, how do we find out whether they had deployed it or not? How do we find out whether, I mean, who all were targeted? How did we find out that Siddharth, Varadarajan and Sushant Singh were in fact targeted? If you can give us some inputs on, next steps that can be taken in order to understand, how can we prove something here?
Okay, see, you start from the phone. I mean, it was evident that what was found on their phones is Pegasus. Okay, I mean, that part is basically way well beyond any reasonable doubt at this point of time. Now, if you're coming back and saying where did the database come from, is that the question you're asking? I mean, where it?
Yeah.
Okay. So the way in which Pegasus works is that it is like a bank locker key, right? And every time they basically add, so think of this very differently. Imagine a big infrastructure for spying, and 99.99% of the infrastructure is actually owned by NSO themselves. The only part of the infrastructure that is held by the government, or whichever government which buys that service, is 0.01%. And that is basically where all the stolen data comes and lands up. I mean, everything else is taken care by NSO. Okay. And the way in which NSO works is that the first and foremost problem about NSO is that how do you know that this is my target versus how do you know you shouldn't know my target? So what NSO has done is they have basically created a vault inside the system that they are giving to you. And in that vault, every time you add a number, it is encrypted by both keys, one by NSO and one by you. And this vault is not given to NSO. I mean, at least that is what their claim was. Okay, but I'll come back to that where it got leaked. And so if I want to add someone else's number, I will add it, and then it goes in the vault and it is encrypted. And NSO systems only know some part of it. They know how to send infections, but they don't really know the phone number. But however, there is a problem with this design. The problem with this design is any infection that you have to do on a phone has to do what is called as a HLR lookup, which is another way of saying a home location registry lookup. And typically that is how you are able to route mobile calls wherever you are in the country or even abroad. This HLR lookup is done by a protocol called SS7. It is pretty old, 45 years old. Multiple vulnerabilities exist. I mean, you can basically hijack anyone's phone for $10 if you know what you are doing. Plenty of incidences have happened in the past where routing happens because of that. So the company that does HLR lookups was called Circle. NSO actually bought it. Now, the most probable hypothesis which I've heard is that every number that any agency in the world puts it on Pegasus leaves a trail on the HLR lookup company called Circle. I mean, NSO bought it, but it is still run as a separate division. Now, which means that if you go and look at the logs of Circle, you will see a trace back to every single number that was added and deleted. So the most likely hypothesis was that all these numbers together, all the 50,000 odd numbers which were tracked by NSO, came from this subdivision called Circle. That is how the names came out. Even looking at the other metadata of the leak database, it is kind of very evident, at least if you know what you're looking for, that most likely it would have come from some division of Circle.
Okay. Anand, I'm going to hand over to Ritesh Bhatia, who has his hands up. Ritesh, 1 second, I'll just promote you to a panelist. Ritesh, over to you. Okay, I guess Ritesh isn't there. There is a question here. Siddharth Singh has asked, can you point me to the receipts of these vulnerabilities of the NSO group?
Receipts? Would you be...
In terms of information about the fact, I guess, that these are the vulnerabilities that they bought.
Yeah, I mean, the PPT has some parts of it. I mean, I can send it over at the end of the call.
We will publish a story with this particular video embedded along with the PPT as well.
Yes, yeah. So most of the links are actually given in the PPT, but if you go back and look at it, even Google wrote a very long blog about forced exploit as early as December.
Okay. Manish is asking about where this transaction with the exploit broker happened. Did this happen on the dark web?
No, it happened on the open web. Everyone knows there are plenty of companies nowadays buy it legally from you. It's a proper legal business. When it started off, it was a bit hush-hush, but nowadays it's pretty legal. There are companies called 0DM which buy and sell vulnerabilities.
Okay. So ROP has asked, they say Pegasus has agreed not to hack US phones. Was a different hacking software used to hack Jeff Bezos's phone?
Okay, so now I'm not very clear about what is the Jeff Bezos story. I mean, at the end of it, someone came back and said it is not even hacked. I've not seen any public indication that it was indeed Pegasus. That is the other one. That is my reading of Jeff Bezos' story. About the +1, remember, the primary reason why NSO said +1 numbers can't be hacked is not technical, it's political. Because they knew that if they get sanctioned way back, that they would be rented out of business. So it is a very minor technical fix, as simple as an if statement in one line of code. That is all that was there. I mean, they removed it and then gave for the FBI to test it internally, which came out also in the New York Times article.
Is it possible for someone to mount a false flag Pegasus attack? Can they use the same SME process names, show connections to the same CNC servers? Great question.
Yeah, well, false flag operations are always part and parcel of the cyber thing. That's pretty hard because you have to get a lot of other traces correct. Okay, pretty difficult, extremely difficult, because at the end of it, remember, in order to go and plant those exact files, including the Apple trace and all, you should follow the same path that Pegasus has followed, which means you would be spending the same amount of time as Pegasus in order to plant those files.
A question from Tushar. How does one detect Pegasus infections in Android?
Well, tough question. The only thing that we know how to do is if they had sent you an SMS for getting the first stage of the payload, and if that SMS had a bunch of domain names which was already in the malware database, that is the only time in which you can come back and say an attempt to infect your phone was conducted. It is not possible for anyone to conclude whether it was indeed infected.
Second part of that question is, in the light of this, has choosing an iPhone over Android for privacy purposes become redundant?
Depends. iPhone is still much harder to crack. Android is impossible to investigate and find out what happened. The jury on this is still a bit edgy in the sense that I would still say that if you're using your iPhone, continue to use it, because there is not much of change that has happened on the real world to say that you should abandon your iPhone and move to Android. I also think that Android is problematic because if they're not adding any of those observability and forensic investigation capabilities, it is like saying I'm safe because no one can look at me.
There's someone called ROP who has a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Rohit. My question is that I noticed that NSO operated in mainstream innovation networks of Israel and Silicon Valley, being bought and sold by Francisco partners, etc. Is it now increasingly common that such surveillance software and malware is developed in mainstream innovation networks?
Yeah, you would have to bank on that because see, intelligence agencies want access. Okay, they've always been complaining about encryption being a problem for them, and so there is a huge demand on the intelligence agency side to say that look, we want access, right? And so spyware has basically become a multi-billion-dollar industry with VCs pouring their bits into it. And so why would you not find vulnerability developers? And if you notice again, this entire notion of cyber warfare and cyber defense and all that kind of stuff, countries are stockpiling zero-day vulnerabilities and cyber weapons, just like how they are stockpiling guns and bullets, right? Would you come back and say investing on munitions is wrong? It is going on a very similar path here too, with mainstream development, with private parties, with VC investment, with government's blessing, and so on and so on. Exactly how they are doing armor and shield development in munitions, they're also doing cyber offense and cyber defense in parallel. There is no fundamental difference between the two sides of the coin.
Thank you.
Anand, great question from an anonymous attendee. Why hasn't Pegasus stopped using easily recognizable process names?
Because if you try to do that, your application will be thrown out. Apple doesn't allow you to use the same application once that is registered in the database. So they have attempted to use misspelled variations of the same name, but not the same name. You can't do that, at least in the Apple iOS system, because it leaves a trace.
Now, Anand, one thing that we hear quite often, in at least on TV debates, is that there are questions that have been raised about these lists of people who have supposedly been infected, and the source of this list is not available. And So the credibility of the media that is reporting on these lists has been raised repeatedly. Is this a legitimate sort of pushback? What is, and even in the Supreme Court, the Attorney General repeatedly raised questions about the credibility of these reports. How does the cybersecurity community view this?
See, for the cybersecurity community, the source of the list, or where the list came from itself, is of very less importance, because it usually follows the trail of evidence. Now, if you follow the trail of evidence, of all the lists that we were able to verify, given the complexities of verifying it, because you could have changed your iPhone, Android is difficult to do, etc., etc. So it is like a factory sampling exercise. We got a list of 50,000, of which we could verify about 1,000, which tells you on a particular factory sampling exercise that the 50,000 is pretty credible, no? Because you could have replaced your iPhone, you could have lost your Android phone. Android phones are difficult to do it. And then you look at the whole bunch of evidence that is available in terms of reverse engineering, CNC servers, and Citizen Labs and Amnesty Tech are pretty credible resources, because this is not the only thing they're doing. They've been involved in hundreds and other cybersecurity research. This is one of those things that just keeps mentioning, right? So a research institute's capability and credibility is based on a whole bunch of historical past evidence that what they have done. And in fact, Apple and Google has acknowledged most of their vulnerabilities and are patching and rolling out fixes, right? What more do you come back and say those institutions are not credible? I don't know.
So what you're saying is the fact that it was a Pegasus infection is more or less confirmed.
Correct.
But the fact that it was the Indian government, one only has to follow the various, like the disclosures and contracts, the ASN that you mentioned, right?
Correct.
ASN?
ASN, yes.
And the fact that this is only given to governments, but beyond that, is there any technical evidence beyond that?
Technical evidence on forensics is impossible, because we can't do live. Until you find the phone, until you give me the phone in which the infection is live happening, we can't find it. No, it is not something that detected when the damn thing was happening on live.
So for many people who are going to view this, there are two questions that come to mind, and I'll go to the other questions later. Number one, how does one detect whether one's phone is affected? Say, if you're, and can you tell me for Android and can you tell me for iOS, how does one detect whether your phone or your Android or your iOS phone has been infected or impacted?
It's actually quite a hard problem. Typically, you would see something amiss. Most of the initial Pegasus infections came because your people's phone were running hot. Okay.
Running hot.
Yeah, running hot.
Like it became very hot.
It became pretty hot, and the battery was draining pretty fast, and so on and so on.
One other person told me that it started blinking, or it started. There was another. I think in one of the initial instances, it was that they got missed calls from a particular UK number on WhatsApp.
Correct.
That was the WhatsApp.
So that was the WhatsApp missed call number. So you would find something pretty suspicious. The iMessage one was really the surreptitious one, right? That got addressed, right? To have a question, usually people have a suspicion that their phones, they are being hacked, for some strange reason. And they usually give their phones for forensic investigation. Sometimes the initial set of Pegasus was directed by running live analysis, by doing a VPN, figuring out what is going on and all that kind of stuff. So it is not easy for a normal person to see whether the phone is malware attacked, particularly as high as Pegasus. It's a nation state weapon. It is not easy for a normal person to figure out whether they're being attacked by that kind of a weapon.
So the other thing that you mentioned during your presentation is that this is a zero-click vulnerability, or a zero-click exploit, which means that, in the WhatsApp case, it could have been because of a missed call on WhatsApp. Now that's been patched, I believe. In case of iMessage, it was, like you said, there was a message that came from a particular email address over iMessage.
Yeah, particular iMessage contact.
It could be so there are it could be that an SMS has been sent or something?
Correct. SMS has been sent, and iMessage has been sent. And
so these are all zero-click, means you don't need to click on something to be
Correct.
infected. It could happen without your knowledge.
Correct.
Even if you delete the message, you've already been impacted.
No, you wouldn't even see the message on your SMS.
Because the message can delete itself?
Yeah.
So under those circumstances, how does one protect oneself from Pegasus?
Well, hard question. If you're a nation state target, honestly, there isn't much you can do about it. You can take some precautions. It is basically cat and mouse game. That is all I can say. Normal malwares, usually they enter because you install an app that you shouldn't, or you basically install a Trojan which look like a normal app, and so on and so on. But if you look at my phone, it has nothing. But even then, you can't be very confident about it, only to a certain extent.
So I think you once told me that OPSEC is more important than technical security. So what are the OPSEC recommendations? Because there are journalists watching this. What are the OPSEC recommendations you would make for them to protect themselves?
See, the first one, the only OPSEC that actually works realistically is compartmentation. Okay, because it is a way of saying that if it is more likely that you're going to be hacked, at least limit the blast radius by compartmenting what you're going to lose. So typically it means use a different phone, use a different set of IDs. When I say IDs, I have 14 phone numbers, 140 email addresses. So your life basically becomes very fragmented, and you precisely know which part of the identity should be given to which person, and then you keep them over a compartmentation line. It kind of works for me because I'm a recluse. Journalists who have to meet people often and have to keep calling. It's kind of a very tough thing. But one of the things that you have to probably think through is that if you are a journalist, then try not to keep all your life in one identity. Most of the journalists I know, the first thing they call me is, give me a phone number, I want to call you. I'm like, no, you can't call me. You have to call me only on Signal. And they're like, okay, but why can't you give me a number? I said, I can't give me a number. Right? I mean, that's usually how it is. But for them, it's as much compartmentation as possible. So like it or not, the situation in any state is that if you're constantly under threat of this kind of malware, you have to start thinking like an intelligence agent. You can't think yourself as a journalist. And an intelligence agent is fundamentally trained on compartmentation, information gathering, using multiple identities, and so on and so on. And that is probably...
Sounds like a very complicated life, Anand.
Yeah, well, that is exactly what Pegasus kind of things brings on you, in the sense that if they find you interesting enough to use Pegasus, I think the countermeasures are equally...
So one other thing that you told me, and which I've actually implemented, is reboot your phone every night,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Why does that help?
Because like it or not, most malwares are now becoming transient, in the sense that they don't leave any traces on your phone. They just come into your phone, do their job, and stay in their memory, and do not leave any files on your phone for persistence. So what it really means is that you keep rebooting your phone, at least after the Pegasus thing. Every day, the loss limitation for your malware is, I mean, it again has to be reinfected. 1 day, yeah.
So, okay, so then you're only at risk for 1 day.
1 day.
But it could also be used, that 1 day vulnerability could be used to insert a file on your device.
Correct.
So what else do you do?
Well, sometimes you just run scans on your phone once a month to see something weird is coming. At least we use... some of us have been using iVerify for quite some time on iPhone. It seems to be okay.
Again, and most people in India use Android. So,
yeah.
Sorry, silly question, but which antivirus or anti-malware software
I don't know.
would you
I
recommend
don't use
for
Android. The only Android I had used is what is called as a Graphene OS, which is so weird that no one would have even heard about it.
Fair enough. So we'll need to go somewhere else for Android recommendations.
No. I think we are working on something that is workable for people. Maybe another 1 or 2 months or 3 months, something would come up which is much more easier. See, the standard Google Pixel is pretty good. The problem that happens, because Pixel gives security updates for a very long time. Nowadays they're giving for 3 years or 5 years. I forgot Google Pixel, the stock OS. Okay. The problem comes with all the vendor-driven OSs. Like, OnePlus and all that kind of guys. A, they don't patch the vulnerabilities. B, they use a very older kernel. And C, they don't give updates for a very long time because their money is not on security updates and money is on selling you the device. So that part still needs to change a lot. And we're just hoping that all this would probably change Google to give more inspectability and observability in the phone. Then I would be more confident to come and say, sure, it's okay, we can detect it. Nowadays, it's literally flying blind on Androids.
So I'll go back to the Q&A, to the question, the Q&A tab, Anand, before we close, because we have about 10 minutes left. There's a question about what are these zero-day markets? How does one access them? Do software vendors monitor them and buy the exploits there?
Yes, the answer is yes. Any big company, which is $1 billion, $2 billion kind of company, which sells IT security products, do monitor the zero-day markets. Okay. What is being bought and what is being sold? There are legal channels, there are dark markets. Almost most of them are now being monitored. But the capability to address them is a very different problem because supply chains are hard. Software supply chains are exceptionally hard to track.
Again, the question, how does one access these zero-day markets?
Well, you have 0DM, which is an open kind of a thing, and you have the CTI feeds, threat feeds that you can subscribe to. All of them would come and tell you about what 0 days are going around.
Do you think zero-day markets should be banned?
No.
Why is that? Because isn't it then, or you mean they would just go into the dark web?
Yeah, see, this entire set of markets came because vendors were uncaring about cybersecurity. They would basically stiff the researchers and they would never pay them.
Okay. Question from another anonymous attendee. Hasn't Palantir been very active in this space for many years now? How different is the Pegasus caper?
Palantir, as far as I know, sells fusion tools. They don't actually develop malware like NSO. At least that is to the extent which I know
of. When you say vulnerabilities are legally sold, is it for devices or operating system versions? Why wouldn't this information be masked by the platform operators?
Vulnerabilities are being sold for everything. Sometimes it is sold for operating systems. Sometimes it is bought by the nation states. See, the biggest buyers of vulnerabilities are also nation states. So at any given point of time, platforms can't stand up to nation states if they want to.
Will the Supreme Court committee be able to understand the technicalities involved and effectively use digital forensics to arrive at the conclusion about whether Pegasus was used and which agency deployed it?
See, which agency deployed it is the answer which I already know. As to what the committee will understand it, I mean, to a large extent, I think they understood it. Their questions, I mean, the deposition is public. Their questions were pretty point blank, accurate, and you would expect anyone who's asking those questions to be reasonably competent in understanding the domain. I mean, I really hope so.
Sure, I'll hand over to Ritesh before we get to the last two questions. Ritesh?
So firstly, Anand, this was amazing. It was an eye-opener. Loved everything about it. Anand, I just need to ask you is, what about the phones that have been formatted now? You know, because there are many of these journalists who come to me and they say like, you know, I have a doubt that this could be infected with Pegasus, but they've done factory reset, you know, erase their phones, whether it's an Android or it's an Apple. Do you think via forensics, the method that you use, we will still be able to like get something out of it, some traces?
No, see, factory reset phones are basically goners. What can you do about it? Because the log files are gone, the SMS databases are gone, and some of their droids I know use that zero wipe, right? Zero secure.
I
mean, zero wipe.
Yes. Because there have been some cases wherein even through a factory reset iPhone, we've been able to remove some traces. I'm not talking about Pegasus. I'm talking about other things like through Cellbrite and all. we've been able to remove certain files, some traces.
Correct.
We've been able to do that. So
Correct.
is it possible that we could also get some, like, I'm not aware about all those Pegasus related traces. I mean,
Celebrite, now that you brought Celebrite, that is a very interesting tool by itself. I really wish I could have a lab running Celebrite on people, but it is what it is. See, Celebrite is interesting because it's a file system extractor.
Correct.
Okay, now once you go to the file system extractor and start taking out HDFS files or ext3 files or ext4 file systems, right? You could recover a lot of files that were deleted. Okay, some of us use, some of the people use ZY, but most of the files, if you have just done factory reset, can be extracted by Celebrite. I've seen that often.
Correct.
Okay, now the interesting part for Pegasus in general is if you're Android, we only look at the SMS database. Okay, because there's anyway no other long-term database. All you just basically do is you look at the SMS database, extract all the SMSs, look at the links and see if the links are matching any known network domains that you have in your database. Okay. That's it. Okay. iPhones are interesting because if you're able to get data usage.SQLite and net usage.SQLite, and if you're able to look at some of the names, you have a pretty decent chance of getting them back.
Got it.
That's it. Only those two files are required. And data usage.SQLite, net usage.SQLite, and in the case of Droid, it is the SMSDB. And Droid, the chance of detection is anyway 5%.
Right. True. Very true.
In iPhone, it's 100% if the phone is not factory reset and these two files are available.
Okay.
That's it. We don't need anything else, really.
Cool. Thank you so much.
There's an important question from Priyadarshini, which has been seconded by an anonymous attendee as well. Where does the Pegasus episode stand in the political history of India? Have similar incidents happened earlier but escaped visibility / discussion?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. How deep you want to answer?
Do you want to talk about Bhima Koregaon?
No, we can go back further.
Okay. Can you give us a history?
Yeah, sure. Why not the history?
Off the top of your head.
Yeah, see, the history of surveillance in India goes back to 2010. So we had the CMS, which no one wants to talk about, the Central Monitoring System, which allows on-demand provisioning and recording of any person's normal landlines and mobile phones in about 5 seconds with no oversight, none whatsoever. In fact, it goes back.
If I may just stop you right there. There is a story that I did, and I think 2009 or 2010, where we found a Delhi police tender on the CMS, and we published the details of what all Delhi police was looking to do with the CMS system.
Oh, really?
And we have done well. That's why you've got almost 15 years of history on MediaNama. You should go and look this up. I'll send the link later. But we've covered this extensively over the years. Sorry, Anand, please carry on.
So that is basically the history of surveillance. I mean, telcos have what is called as a surveillance port. I mean, every telco equipment that is being sold here has a surveillance port. And without surveillance port, you can't even ship a device into India. That is basically how it has always been. And then you go back and look at the Ramakrishna Hegde kind of scandals. And then on 2010 or 2011, you had this newer variety of surveillance equipment called as a Stingrays or drive-through mobile vans, where you just mount those things and you can just drive through. It just picks conversations all around. And then you now have Pegasus. So the only difference is that the surveillance evolves based on how people are using a particular mode of communication. CMS came during the landline and the SMS mobile time frame. Then the drive-through Stingrays came when mobile phones are becoming the primary mode of communication, but still on voice and 2G. And Pegasus has come when everyone is using 4G and encryption. I mean, that is basically how it has always been. But having said all this on the political side, what is pretty new about Pegasus and the Bhima Koregaon kind of cases is that there is extensive amount of planting that is being done. That is new. Because in the older model of surveillance, it is just hearing what you're talking, whom you're talking. I mean, what is the latest political move you're planning, and so on and so on. But as we have seen with the Bhima Koregaon and the Pegasus kind of an examples, using tools that are fundamentally can also be repurposed for doing planting and using malware and all that stuff is pretty new. This is something that I don't think the state should have ever embarked on. And them embarking fundamentally puts almost all civil liberties under risk, because if today your device is compromised, there is no other civil liberty that is really required. And even here, you think about, I'll give an example. Even the crash, even the flights that Pegasus planted, it is very difficult for me to go and explain to a judiciary officer because it takes about 5-6 years of history to tell them in multiple ways to get it right. And while I can say with a lot of confidence that this file is planted, whether the court would agree to it or not is a very different criminal procedure and Evidence Act problem altogether. So using these tools are actually fundamentally very deadly to, I wouldn't say democracy, but to the basic liberty and right to exist. That is a source of great concern for me. National security targets, I get it, but not normal people.
Last question, Anand, in case anyone has any others. What is the additional cost of putting Pegasus on each device?
Additional cost? It used to be about $8 million was the equipment price, if I remember it right. And for every 50, it's like a 1-year contract. You get about $8 million, if I remember it right, with all the equipments and everything. It's every year you have to renew it for 8 million or 6 million. And the capability of one license with that one device is 50 targets. So you can basically say 8 million by 50.
Great. I think we're done with questions, Anand. Thank you so much for taking time out to speak with. I think Oyhik has a question. Sorry, Oyhik, go ahead.
Hi, Anand. This is Oyhik here. So since you spoke about Celebrite, I just wanted to ask if how does Celebrite work? You need to physically have the device for Celebrite to run, right?
Yes, it's a seizure. Celebrite usually is done by the intelligence and law enforcement by doing a seizure.
Yeah. So after the file extraction is done and everything, does of Celebrite state are traces still available? Will be available on the equipment after?
Yeah. It's an extraction. It can just extract your entire file system. After that.
Okay.
It's like full-fledged file system extraction of your hard disk. That's the way to think about it.
Okay.
I remember MediaNama ran a very long article series on Celebrite. I remember Aditi wrote it. That part I tracked, not the CMS.
Right, it was perhaps before you knew us, Anand, that we did CMS. So I've put two, before we close, I've put links to 2 stories in chat. One is a story that I had done about the Home Ministry putting together a tender for the CMS. Okay. And the second was essentially Delhi Police's CMS tender, both are from 2011.
Okay.
We don't have a copy of that tender. I think it's been removed from the site, but now we've actually started maintaining offline copies of all the documents that we do our stories based on. Okay. I'm talking about government documents.
Okay.
Great.
Good.
Thanks, Anand. Thanks for a fantastic talk, and thank you everyone for joining us. Like we said at the beginning, we usually do these as members calls. So if you're a MediaNama member, please do keep in mind that next week, in all probability, we're going to do a talk on what's happening in Ukraine from a cyber perspective, but also about what the repercussions might be because some actions that are being taken by platforms for crypto. And there's going to be an open conversation. So do join us for that. And if you're subscribed, thanks for subscribing. Anand is a subscriber. Thanks, Anand. Great, and looking forward to the next call. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.